All right, men. So here we are again, and we're going to start the chat this time with the idea that as members of a kingdom, what is the state of our union? Where are we at? What's going on with the church, with our country? Even though we have listeners from all over the world, I'm sure. I know some people from Australia, even not as far from here you can get, are going to be listening. But I expect at the same time, we're going to have in pretty much any first world country a lot of similar issues and trends. And so let's just talk about what's going on in the world today, and especially in God's kingdom, and what needs to be done. So I would hope that the first part of this, we're going to talk about, what are the major trends and problems we're seeing, but that we're also going to dive into what can we as men do about that. Anybody have any thoughts?
I think when I look at the church today, I can really see that they define success in worldly terms, in terms of how many people come. I mean, they're nonprofits. They have to, by default have to become, have to run like a business. Whereas, from a kingdom standpoint, success is building disciples, bringing people to know Christ. And it's just, once you open your eyes, it's really easy to see that disconnect of, wanting to get numbers of people in the seats and more programs, more people through the door, as opposed to, what are we actually doing for the kingdom of God?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that stands out to me is a number of years ago, the bad boy of the church, the uber masculine, influence in at least the American church was Mark Driscoll. And that guy is so not a super macho dude in so many ways, so far off from anything that we would consider like red pilled or even just like biblical masculinity. It still amounts to serve your women is his message at the end of the day. And that was seen as too controversial for most of the church because it was too masculine. And so I think that speaks volumes about where we're at and where the state of masculinity in the church is. I would challenge anyone here to name one place where masculinity is truly celebrated in the church, at least in America.
I can't name any popular
It's a big challenge because it's pretty hard to find.
Yeah, I've made a lot of similar challenges myself with different topics off and on, but one of the ones that comes up is, you'll hear a lot of churches that will preach, especially around Mother's Days. We just had yesterday. And so you'll hear a lot of churches that will preach about, husbands, love your wives, and talk about all, Christ sacrificed for her and gave up this and that. But at the same time, there are some aspects of what it means to be like Christ that we just tend to ignore. And so like when people ask that question, one of the first things that I try to spout back is, okay, that's not a problem. I completely agree. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. One of the things the Bible says is that the Lord disciplines those they love. So when's the last time you heard a sermon on the proper way to discipline your wife?
And that is crickets we are listening to.
Yeah, it's been a while.
So fortunately, we have guys like Blue Pill Professor who will actually put content on there where he basically acknowledges, yes, there's, because of the legal system we have today, some risk in how you approach things, but there are ways that as men we can be leaders and set boundaries and enforce them.
I think here's kind of the greater problem is everything we just said I agree with, and I think that most people who are thinking of biblical would agree with, yet nonetheless that is still an entirely far too controversial stance to take, and even a suggestion to put out there in most churches. And so I think about on the macro level, the church has become so feminized that, to use the term reformation is kind of a loaded term historically, but nothing short of that, in my mind, can change the trajectory of where we're at. And fortunately, I think we're seeing some of the seeds of that in some avenues. They're just the very on the fringe avenues at this point. Like pulling up like the Gospel Coalition website, and you go through and you look at all of the different articles that are listed along the way. It's really interesting to see just how many of them are so far off base from anything that we would think is helpful. So one of them that comes up that was posted today: in marriage, as in life, weak is strong. Yeah, weakness is strong. and they try to make this case that basically challenging marriages are God's way of disciplining us and making us more holy. And it's a whole, like, marriage isn't meant to make you happy, it's meant to make you holy. And I don't see that in the Bible. Not directly. That's not the primary function thereof, but that's become kind of an accepted thing because marriages in the church are generally so shitty that we have to somehow make it a gospel issue of, oh, it's actually meant to be shitty.
Got to get the hamster wheel spinning, rationalize it all. So let's ask that question then, because I do think that that is something that deserves a worthwhile conversation. Is what is the purpose of marriage then? If we say that, you know, it's not necessarily to make somebody holy or happy, like, how would you want to approach that? Or do you say it is to make you happy? Or are we to say that people shouldn't be striving for holiness out of the way they learn from their marriages?
Well, to be really base about it, the purpose of marriage is to ensure that men know who owns which women, and therefore they can cooperate. It allows male cooperation. Marriage is foremost a means of social technology for men to operate in cohesion and allow society to grow from that. So it's basically a property structure, and that's
so where do you pull that from Scripture?
So as far as from Scripture, I think it's assumed. And so you look at the status of women throughout the Old Testament, for example, the idea that, for example, Sarah would have this ability to tell Abraham, hey, I need you to go wash the dishes or something like that. It seems absolutely ludicrous to us, and for good reason, because we understand that there was a clear understanding that Sarah belonged to Abraham in a way that is unique. And you think about even adultery and the idea of adultery, it's distinctly a status of the woman issue, and I think the whole point of that is to clarify who is basically taken already, so that men aren't competing for one another. It's the basic idea of how do you keep male competition in check to allow men to cooperate.
I like it.
Anybody else have thoughts on the purpose of marriage?
I would think pre-grace, like, basically Old Testament, that marriage and the family was God's primary vehicle to build his kingdom. Was the way that, through procreation, go forth and multiply, teach your, there's numbers of scriptures and that's how, through marriage and the family,
I think we lost you for a second.
God filled the earth. Now we know post.
Yep.
Am I back?
Yep, you're good.
And then post grace, after the cross, now through evangelism and discipleship, we can spiritually multiply. Doesn't necessarily discount the value of marriage and the family, but
so this is going to kind of deviate from. I was going to say this is going to deviate from kind of the overarching topic. So if this ends up being too much of a rabbit trail, call me out on it.
Yeah.
But the idea of pre-grace and post-grace, I take exception to, and I mean this is going to be down to a doctrinal difference. How did Abraham relate to God? Was it by grace or was it by any other system?
It was by grace.
Right. So grace operated in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And I would argue that the purpose of marriage, yes, is in part to allow for the procreation of children and the nurturing thereof of the godly community. I don't think that purpose has changed. I think that maybe there's a different spiritual component to it. But I think that if you look at the number of Christians that are alive today, the vast majority of them are Christians because they were born into a Christian family, not because they converted into Christianity.
I would say that's right. In my experience, so the purpose of marriage spiritually is to, like, God's pointing us towards, hey, this is the closest intimacy you guys can experience on this earth. And he wanted us to know that that's our relationship with him was that much greater, and then that procreating is only possible by marriage, or like not possible by marriage, but biblically that's what he wanted, procreation. And so God wanted godly children, and he wanted to produce legitimate Christian disciples, or I guess godly children. There's Malachi 2:15 that talks about that, and what was So guard yourselves in your spirit, and let none of you be faithless to the wife of your youth. Something like that. And so kind of coupling it with what Oz says, where it's a social technology, combined with like God wanted godly, godly offspring. The only way to or I'd say a really effective way to produce godly offspring was to agree that maybe God set this technology up, but then we use it, and hopefully we have spiritual offspring, or I guess physical offspring that are also godly offspring. It's kind of my spin on it.
Yeah. So what I would say is kind of similar to what you and Dross have been saying is, when I look at scripture, the imperative from the beginning is, of course, bear fruit, multiply, fill the earth, and number, all of that. And so obviously Adam and Eve did that. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to run the numbers, but I've posted this on RPC a couple times before, that there are, if you take conservative projections using even lower birth rates than we have today, which is ridiculous because people back then were having way more than 2.3 kids per household. They were having dozens. But even with conservative birth rates, if you take the amount of years there were from Adam and Eve to the flood, and you also take the ages that people were living, then you get something to the effect of that there was anywhere on the low end, people estimate between 10 and 100 billion. On the high end, some people have estimated even as much as 1 trillion people on the earth at the time of the flood. I don't know exactly, what would happen with those numbers and how they actually played out, but the idea is that they pretty well filled the earth in number. God had no interest in the type of just having warm bodies on the earth, because as they became, send a flood, wipe them all out, and some just about warm bodies. But rather, like you were alluding to, Levi, with Malachi 2:15, the passage itself, I think, is just very powerful to read. And why did the Lord God make them one, commingling a portion of his spirit in their union? And of course, he answers the question immediately after, to produce godly offspring. And so the idea there is the godly part is what they were missing when the pre-flood days had occurred. And so that at this point we are now in a spot of recognizing God wants us to be producing people who are alive in spirit, who are godly and Christ-like. And realistically, with the gospel as we know it, the only way that that can truly happen is when people are saved. And so, like you guys have been saying, it's about producing spiritual offspring, first and foremost through your own family and children, and then after that by branching out. And as Paul and Peter and John and Jesus, like everybody had this language where they understood that the people that they were ministering to were their children. And as the bride of Christ, it's our job to, as we are one with our groom, go off and produce spiritual fruit, and therefore the imperative to make disciples, which I believe is the purpose of marriage.
So I don't have any disagreement with that from a biblical standpoint, that is the purpose of marriage. I'm in full agreement that ultimately it's to bring about godly offspring for God's kingdom. But that doesn't explain the totality of the meaning of marriage, because we see non-Christian, non-Israelite society still adopting marriage as a practice. And so you look across the world and you still see marriage used in just about every culture, even if it was modified in some way and it reflects whatever that culture happened to do as marriage. But in just about every culture, there was some sort of ritual engagement that a man would do to ensure that that woman was seen as not on the sexual marketplace any longer. And so whatever that looked like, that had to serve a purpose that was actually utilitarian in some sort of nature. Yeah. Otherwise, we wouldn't see it spread. And I think what we saw is that marriage became an effective way for allowing men to cooperate, because they could no longer, pit themselves against one another, because they had this tribal agreement effectively that, hey, if you screwed around with another guy's wife or whoever did this ritual, you got killed in some way. That's the penalty for adultery and why it's so stiff, because if you don't have that kind of disincentive, you're not going to have guys cooperating with one another. And so you had a bunch of societies where men could cooperate with one another, and they totally trounced all the societies that didn't adopt marriage as a practice. And so in the same way that going from, not using metal weaponry or tools became a standard because people with metal weaponry and tools, it was a greater technology, and it put anybody who didn't have that who is in contact and competition out of the game. Similarly, marriage served a practical, useful, social, technological purpose. And so I think that is, on a very base level, the meaning of marriage, or the point of marriage, is to serve that function. Now, from a Christian standpoint, we see something different in that there is more to it than that, but is not less than that. And the problem is the church is bad at both of those things.
Yeah.
So it's
So
like
I guess it
there's
sounds
a
like
world purpose to it.
Correct.
I was going to say, it sounds like there's a purpose to it, and from a world standpoint, but then there's the overarching God's design of it too.
Correct.
That makes a lot of sense. So obviously, like you had commented at the end, then, that the church at large seems to have abandoned, both aspects of this function of marriage, and has, made other statements where I think Levi had commented on how, the church is saying, oh, marriage is not about making you happy, about making you holy, right? And we're trying to create these alternative purposes for it. So, Oz, let's just ask this. What would it look like in modern society if we were to try to revert marriage back to the way that you're suggesting?
Short of total societal overhaul, I don't know if that's possible. I think that there's kind of a few key components for marriage to function the way it was designed. First of all, I think the idea of no-fault divorce kind of guts the teeth behind the enforcement of the marital covenant. So if you can't enforce a marital covenant with anything that's a serious deterrent, you're not going to reap the benefit of men truly being able to cooperate with one another. And you look at what's happened in our society, divorce is primarily initiated by women. Christians divorce at a rate that's alarmingly high, even compared to the rest of culture. And so we see that clearly there's no major disincentive enough to keep women from straying, or keeping men from, more importantly, I guess, since women, hypergamy, they're going to operate a certain way. But having men stab one another in the back, so to speak. And this happens in the church too. It's somewhat less frequent, I would hope, but it still happens. And so I think that there has to be a very high social disincentive for that sort of behavior to reap the first benefit of marriage. And I think the second part of it is, I think that we just have, as a church, to really come to grips with the idea, if we're here to use, if marriage is there to produce godly offspring, then the church has to support efforts to end abortion, efforts to end homosexuality, or to, revert some of these social practices that have minimized the ability for godly offspring to occur. And I think some of it, from a societal level, it's so punitive to have children, in the sense of we've developed a society that is kind of based around a dual income format. And so if you have the woman stay home, or the man, whoever, stays home, you have one provider. That's going to be a much more challenging circumstance than it used to be, where it was the expectation that the mother stayed home and did the nurturing element of raising children. And so I think that when you look at it, short of societal overhaul, I don't know if there's an easy answer. But I think the church can be a huge part of that answer. And I think a lot of that has to do with expectations. And I don't think a lot of Christians have even thought about these things to a high degree, or have any kind of expectations that differ from cultural.
So there would need to be a conversation. How would that conversation go with, like, pastors or other people bringing that up? Like, we need to get to point B, we're at A, how do we do that? And part of that journey is practical steps to take away any incentive of divorce, to disincentivize it. Is that a word? I think that's
yeah.
Yes.
Well, and this would be an area where I think John would have some good insight. But I think the idea, okay, so when I got married in the church, there was a big topic of conversation around not doing any kind of prenup. And basically, don't plan your divorce ahead of time was kind of the gist of the conversation. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a huge degree of legal stuff that I wouldn't know how to get into. But when you think about the lack of a prenup in our current modern day setting, kind of incentivizes bad behavior by women.
Mm-hmm.
And the church has totally rejected that as a tool to potentially incentivize. So how often do we hear about situations where she marries the guy who who's well off and built his own fortune. She divorced him, and he's SOL. Well, in that situation, by not having some sort of we've incentivized by really resisting the idea of protecting that sort of wealth ahead of time. It's saying, hey, there's this cool carrot on the stick here. All you got to do is ditch this guy, and you're going to get a lot of money from it. So being able to at least take the teeth out of some things like that might be a first step.
Yeah. So on the prenup angle,
at the same time, it's also cheapened the sanctity of marriage as well. By having such the easy out, it's made it not as I'm losing the word, not as important as what it was obviously designed to be.
Yeah. So from the prenup angle, a lot of what I see when I'm drafting these things and what people are negotiating out is it is not at all what people think, where, oh, you're negotiating out and planning your divorce ahead of time. Usually people trying to create boundary, disincentivizing divorce in the first place. And that's why a lot of people really like them, and why I often encourage them is, without obviously you're bound to whatever the laws your state has. If everybody, at least most guys nowadays, who I talk to, are starting to wise up and realize, oh goodness, the laws are not necessarily that great for me, then there gives a reason to say, okay, well, I'm going to want some kind of a protection in place. But nobody goes into a prenup thinking, well, I'm going to negotiate into my prenup that I can divorce you for any reason that I want to whatsoever, and you get nothing. Like, that just doesn't happen.
Right.
Because everybody realizes that the person on the other side isn't going to agree to that, right? Instead, what you're saying is, hold on, if you do these outrageous things that you should not be doing, then there should be some penalty, even if the law naturally wouldn't give that to you. So that's a lot of what prenups go into.
See, I think what's ironic is if you look at some of the boundaries to marriage, especially given in the law books of the Old Testament, there's a much stronger, obviously, disincentive to extramarital affairs and all these other things that really ruin the ability for marriages to be successful. Nowadays, we have a very permissive, and the church pretty much ascribes large to the societal system and says this is the way it needs to be, which is really funny to me because that's not how God set it up. Anyways, God set up very strong disincentives and very clear conditions for certain things, and to suggest that you can use the existent legal system to try and bed those or put some of those things embedded into the marital agreement, it's so strange to me that it's met with such resistance. And I only imagine that the feminine paradigm and imperative really working its way through the church, in that it feels like oppressing women or something like that, and because it feels icky, it must be bad.
Also, just a side note for our viewers, I don't know if we stated that before, but that's his career and he's good at it. So
I don't know if that came through because I just got a big lag there for a second as you were talking.
Oh man.
What did you say?
Well, basically, you're a divorce lawyer. I don't know if we mentioned that. It gives context to what you were saying earlier. That's all.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, it's definitely worth noting. So what would it take? I guess, I mean, you've already talked about a total legal overhaul. Short of being able to infiltrate Congress and get everything switched around and, be more traditional in how things were approached, even as late as the 50s, which were still not ideal, but a heck of a lot better than today. Outside of that, what are other options that men have available without, hoping for some kind of ridiculous miracle?
Well, I think that part of it is we can't control the greater, culture. We can't control the Congress, as you mentioned. There's a lot that we can't control, but we can control ourselves. And I guess that's part of the ultimate, like what the red pill boils down to is fix yourself. I think helping other men in our sphere of influence figure out what they can do to better themselves, better their lives. My hunch, I guess, is if that happened enough, then there would be more guys who reject things like good idea or a good book. And I think that some of it is just we have bad leaders in the Christian church. And I think that because of that, we have a lot of bad theology and bad thinking around these things, and thought ultimately leads to behavior. And so I think that there needs to be more guys influencing other men to try to have better ideas about how these, how God ultimately wants us to practice things like marriage. I don't know if that's enough to solve the problem, but I think that getting people thinking about this is a huge part of it, and one of the reasons why I'm involved in RPC to begin with.
So
Yeah, I got to really agree with that and resonate, because you can really get wrapped around the axle, reading media, reading news, like John said, thinking about Congress. But if you want to make a change, like Oz says, you got to focus on yourself and focus on your sphere of influence. And I really think as you take responsibility and grow as a man, God will grow your sphere of influence.
Yeah.
And you begin affecting more and more men, rather than come up with this grand scheme of how you're going to go fix this and fix that. Start at square one. Get yourself.
So especially today, there's a lot of people who are. Yeah. So especially today, there's a lot of people who are really focused on the idea of, oh, well, I'm going to watch the news and see what's going on with Corona, or see if presidential elections, all kinds of big things happening, and I want to be in the know of what's going on, which is great. You should be an informed citizen. Absolutely, be informed before you vote. But at the same time, one of the things that I get really frustrated with that, not their own limited ability to actually do anything about it. And so it's cool if you want to watch a bunch of politics type stuff and really get into understanding the ins and outs of whatever the new healthcare system is going to be, or whether or not we're going to build a wall and what that looks like, right? But at the same time, if you're really upset and passionate about something, the solution is not necessarily just watch it and complain on the internet. Yes, the internet can have some kind of an influence, but at the same time, you're either going to step up and go join the political arena yourself, run for office, and try to make a difference by growing up the ladder, or you're going to take the more pragmatic approach and just focus on yourself and what you can do in your immediate sphere and influencing those around you. And how does that best happen? Oh, by making disciples. Because anybody can go up and teach a class, but whenever you teach a class or stand on the street corner with a megaphone, you're going to get some people who agree and others who don't. But really, all you're going to really accomplish is get the people who already agree to you to really think about it a little bit more. But very rarely will you actually persuade somebody from that position. Whereas if you're making disciples, where you're life on life with somebody and you're modeling and saying, hey, I'm going to sit and show you how to do what I do and think how I think and live how I live, so that way you can carry on into the world with the same principles, that's where you're really going to make a difference. And the more you do that and teach other people to expand on that, that's how I think a lot of the difference is going to be made.
Yeah, I think that your point is well said, as far as we can't do anything with those things we can't control. And I think that we may undersell sometimes the influence one person can have in a local congregation. And I just think, as I've read a lot of posts and interacted with a lot of people who are part of the RPC sub, there's this really strong desire among the men to be part of a community where they don't have to shy away from, hide, or feel the pressure to somehow, minimize their masculinity. So how could we change things in the church? I think partly, can you make a local congregation a place where strong men don't feel like they need to leave? That would probably be a good starting point.
Amen. Build a tribe.
Yeah. Into a really good point. So God is really strategic. There's the whole Reckless Love song, which is just a load of baloney. But God was really strategic in everything he did. And so there's a complete lack of strategy in the way we go about things, like discipling and a lot of other things. Not here in RPC. There's a lot of strategy to that, a lot of framework, not a program. But there's certain things in our psychology, that make it easy for us to, or make it attractive for us to join a tribe. Or the best modern day representation of a tribe is all these multi-level marketing companies. And there's this guy, I'm studying marketing right now for my business. There's a guy, Russell Brunson, has a really good book. He went and studied all the movements, the cults, the MLMs, and he's like, what do they all have in common? And it turns out they have some very common things. And I haven't read it yet. I'm still on another book of his, but use it. A lot of my friends I've talked about, hey, there needs to be this change, and they're like, oh, it's only going to happen by a move of the Spirit, which there's total, like, I'm not disagreeing with that. If there's going to be a change, like, it's going to have to be a move of the Spirit, but we have the Spirit of
and
Jesus
in us.
Who does the
Spirit move to accomplish these things, right?
Exactly. Like, he's not just going, like, I have this desire. Everybody else that I've talked to is like, yes, there's these problems, but everybody's waiting for God to magically, like, say, hey, poof, here's this, I want you guys to do it exactly like this, and it has to be Spirit led. You guys can't plan, you can't strategize, you can't take advantage of knowing human psychology. And it's like, well, actually, there's no biblical precedence for that. So one thing that I'm going to do here eventually, as I read through this next book of his, is look and see what sort of things that take advantage. How can I implement that into the church, restoring masculinity and moving towards the broader goal of discipleship?
I think the phenomenon you describe, people waiting for some sort of obvious movement of the Spirit, is ultimately it's a form of cowardice, and it's a form of beta behavior. There was a couple guys that I knew in a church that I used to attend in my younger years, and they had these girlfriends, and they wanted to know, is she the one? And they would, I'm waiting on the Spirit, man. Like, I need to have peace with God in my heart. And basically they ended up not doing anything. And it's so weak and stupid, but we do that. You're right. When we just like, oh, I'm going to just throw up my hands, get comfortable here and wait for God to move. It's like, what do you think he moves? He moves people, his church. That's you. Like, get moving, start building.
Mm-hmm.
It's so passive. There's so many other Bible characters
to do it.
Yeah, there's so many other stories and took action, moved by God in prayer with God, speaking to God, but they took action.
And then there was, I think it was the prophet, was it Prophet Elijah? He was like, there's going to be 3 years of rain. He didn't even hear a word from the Lord. He's just like, this is a prophecy. It's going to happen. I have full confidence. And he went with it. And look what happened. God honored it.
Yep.
So,
yeah, definitely.
I'll probably boil what I learned in that book down in a post, because I haven't heard anything about, I used to be part of a multi-level marketing system, and it was great. Like, they did things amazingly. Obviously not everybody stuck around, including myself, but they had a thing going on. So I'm wondering, like, what things we can take from that and use that in a spiritual sense, because they're like slamming out disciples left and right. Like, they're all about discipleship for money.
So I would be cautious with trying to use too much and draw from multi-level marketing plans and business tactics. And the reason for that is, if you look at, and this is probably another broad State of the Union kind of thing to talk about. Actually, I'm going to cut us off there. All right, sorry about the blip there. We had to say goodbye to Dross, but what I was going with is the idea that in 1 Samuel 9, I believe, there's this part where the Israelites are talking about wanting a king. And they specifically go to Samuel and say, can we get a king just like all the other nations have? And Samuel, of course, tells them, that's a horrible idea. You've got God. He's your king. Why do you need anybody else? Let him rule his people. And they say, oh, no, we really insist on this king. And he warns them, says, don't worry, trust me, if you get a king, it's going to be the destruction of you. Everything's going to fall apart. He'll end up ruining everything. And they say, too bad, we want a king anyway. And the ultimate reason they wanted that is because they wanted to be just like the world and to do things the way the world did it. And really, the line of the kings ended up being the downfall of Israel. I mean, we see maybe 4 good kings out of the entire of Israel and Judah who were really upright, righteous people. And pretty much everybody else screwed them over and led them into disaster and ultimately their captivity into Babylon. And so at some point throughout history, and this is probably another discussion for another day, but like, I am totally anti the idea of seminary, because at some point, what I see is that especially around the 300s AD, when we start seeing religious schools popping up more and more, it's coming from this idea that, oh, well, Constantine authorized everybody to be Christian and it was no longer illegal. And then Theodosius I makes it so that everybody has to be Christian. There's so many people flooding in through the doors. We don't know how to handle it. Jesus didn't set a precedent for that type of growth because it was never meant to happen that way in the first place. But the apostles certainly set up structures in place to make it happen, but they abandoned those, went for a McDonald's type of mass marketing of the church and just, run people through a mill, let them show up on Sunday. Instead of actual communion, we get these, eat a crack, drink a little sip of grape juice. And that's kind of where things went. And so at that point, when they were having so many people, they needed to raise up leaders for everybody. So instead of discipling leaders, they decided to take the approach of, well, what does the world do? Well, there's educational institutions where the philosophers and business leaders and everybody are learning in order to get their apprenticeship and education. So we're going to do the same thing and start training people through educational classes, and eventually seminaries start creeping up. And it's really the church trying to do things the way the world did it, not necessarily through the model of discipleship that Jesus gave. And the same thing, I would be very weary about taking let's look at what the business world does today and base our church model on how the business world does it, when in reality, we have a model that Jesus showed us that we need to be looking at as the primary source material.
Yeah, I'm coming at from the perspective of, just like we've come to the conclusion that the red pill is real, it's implicitly stated in the Bible and culture shuns it. So like same vein of thinking, that's where the Bible describes all this stuff, and a lot of it's just implicit. Like a lot of the things I've learned about discipleship, I've read the Bible 4 times through in its entirety, and before my conversation with you, I just somehow completely missed discipleship. That it's like I knew it was this thing, but I really didn't. I didn't even come to the conclusion of like, tell them what, show them how, let them try, send them out, have them repeat it. Those like 5 things. That's really, it's a way of life. It's intentional. That's what discipleship is. So just in the same way you've arrived at those conclusions in a biblical, but also implicit, that's what I'm thinking when I say, like, I'm going to see if this is what's described in the Bible, but said implicitly in the Bible.
Yeah, I'm very resistant to the idea of business tactics being employed in the church, in part because I was a business major and in part because I've seen it turn churches into McDonald's, and Christ has a bigger vision than that for churches. And I think part of it is, if you think about business, it's the customer's always right. Well, the gospel is the customer's always wrong. The customer needs to be corrected. And so I think that in the very guts of it, you end up with kind of a mismatch of what the mission of the church really is for. And I think that we don't have necessarily a problem of having too many people in the church or not enough people in church. We have too many of the wrong people in the church. And what I mean by that is the church is a costly thing. It should be a costly thing. It should be a challenging thing. It should demand something of its participants. And that is something that the modern evangelical society at large resists, is asking anything of anyone. And that, I think, is where we end up with a very low commitment, very low devoted, and low discipleship model that has been plaguing us for at least a generation now.
So how do we go
Which,
about—
by the way, is, just to hit on that point real fast, this is no different than what we see happening in marriages, right? Because at this point in our nation's marital laws, in most places in the world even, you can really, if you're unhappy with what's going on in your marriage, you just say, okay, I'm out, and you go find another person, right? And that's the same thing that happens with our churches. Everybody says, oh, well, I don't like what's going on in this one, so I'm out, I'll just go find another one. And there's really nothing that you could do, because from the way that church culture has raised itself, there is no imperative for people to stay in the congregation they're in and to follow through with any commitments or to build in roots where they're at, because there's going to be literally on any street, you're going to find 5 different congregations within a mile span, right? And so at some point, there's got to be some kind of an imperative for us to be able to say, no, this is not just about getting people in the door. And I think that's part of what the big problem is that the churches are so desperate to get people just sitting in the pews. I don't know if it's for financial reasons or if it's for self-validation purposes, that they think, oh, the more people I have, I must be doing something right, and therefore the numbers affirm me as a leader, right? And so that could be a problem as pastors. There's a number of things we could go into with that, but the idea is that if we're not setting some kind of clear boundary, we're never actually making any growth as far as helping people become more like Christ and getting the gospel in the nations. Instead, all we're doing is placating people and creating this system, which is kind of what our government is doing, by the way, where everybody is so dependent on the leadership because they haven't learned to feed themselves. They're just living off of their weekly ration that's handed out from the pastor.
So this might be the wrong question, but what are some, gosh, I'm kind of brain farting here, but what would you start doing immediately in your congregation, John, to maybe disincentivize people from leaving, but also to incentivize people to stay? And I think of like like people need investment, like a heavy investment. Becoming a Christian isn't just this like, oh, hey, I can take it or leave it whenever I want. It's like your whole life should be changed. And so in the context of like, you need to put some serious skin in the game to get people, maybe not to get people to stay. Like, I don't think my words are coming out, but I guess back to the incentivizing and then disincentivizing thing. Like, what are some things you would do when the whole COVID-19 thing opens up or dies down?
So off the top of my head, the first thing that comes to mind is what not to do, which is what I believe the nations today really struggle. I try not to call them churches anymore because there's a fundamental disagreement I have with the idea of ecclesiology in the first place. But even setting that aside, what they're really doing today is saying, hey, we want you to be incentivized to stay because of the relationships you will build here. You're going to have a family atmosphere and you're going to connect with other believers and it's going to be a fun, joyous time. But the problem is that they're not actually facilitating and building those relationships. In fact, when I've asked people, and I've done surveys on this and I really dug in, I've done a lot of research on it, and I'm finding that realistically there's no difference among church people versus non-church people with loneliness statistics and authentic friendships. And when I've done surveys before myself, I found that most people, especially pastors, don't actually have genuine friendships in the church. And when you ask people who are your best friends, they're always listing somebody that they met over in college, or it's usually some non-Christian friend who they do goofy fun things with. And it's never the person that they go to Bible study with, right?
Can I throw out a guess as to why I think that is?
Yeah, sure.
Because the church has an HR department that you can complain to and get people in trouble and ruin their lives. And so people aren't genuine to explain. And what I mean by HR department, it's going to be the wives of the guys in the church who, if you confide something in another guy in the church, he goes and tells his wife, she goes and tells your wife, and now you have a shitstorm on your hand. Or they go and tell the pastor. Mm-hmm. There's no camaraderie, there's no brotherhood. And I think that all communities start on the notion of brotherhood and build from there. The idea that the family is the building block of civilization, I believe, is true, but families don't work without brotherhood to create a society for them to exist within and to thrive within. And so I think that going after brotherhood in the church is where you end up with a situation where guys can have genuine community, and therefore their families can have genuine community as well, because there's already an established paradigm. And I think that, think about when somebody says, hey, we're going to have a men's function or a men's teaching or a men's retreat. You immediately think, okay, this is going to be the place where they tell us what we're doing wrong, and they're going to beat us over the tail about, oh, stop watching porn, listen to your wives more, make sure you serve more. It's never like, hey, man is the glory of God, or, man is glorious. God has created him that way. Like, let's celebrate men. No, it's always like, let's beat your tail and tell you why you suck. Well, gee, that doesn't foster brotherhood very well. So I think that is a good reason, or one of the explanations as to why people are so lonely in the church and why their best friend is somebody else, because they can go confide in somebody else without fear of their reputation being cratered at church.
Not to mention the fact that if women are empaths, as we talked about on RPC quite a bit, at least in past days, not as much recently, but if women are empaths and they pick up their emotional state from how their husbands are feeling, right? Imagine if every husband in the church is feeling like, oh my goodness, I don't have any real camaraderie or fellowship or brotherhood And so they have that disconnect. That's going to come off on their wives too, and they're going to feel that way. And I noticed that even though women in the church tend to communicate with each other a lot, even the loneliness demographics, like I talked about before when I did that study on loneliness, which I have a post on that if you want to go through my history, I showed that pretty much across the boards, women are even lonelier than men are. And that's just a bizarre thing to me, when there's this perception, of course, out in the public that women are these social butterflies who are so great at picking up conversations. I've had so many, probably 4 or 5 guys who have made comments to me in the past about how, their wives can just be walking through the mall and see somebody with a scarf they like. And sure enough, they start a conversation and they were talking for half an hour, right? But despite all of that, are actual relationships being built, and what are those built on? But all of that aside, I don't want to get too derailed. To go back to your question, Levi, because I know that I told you what will not work, which is the fake type of relationships that the church is trying to build. Instead, what I do think will work is giving people a purpose and giving them a bar that they have to live up to. And so a lot of times, if we give away things for free, right, all kinds of swag, it would be great, nice to be able to pick up a pen just off some table on the street because people are giving them away. But at the end of the day, I'm going to throw that pen away, right? Because pens are cheap. They're not worthwhile. There's nothing that's going to make me invested in it. But if I have to pay $10 for a particular pen because it's a really good, high quality pen, you better believe I'm going to keep that pen around, right? So when we start giving things away for free, we make them cheap and worthless and useless. And this is what we talk about in marriages too, right? I'm sure that every guy on RPC to some degree can recognize the idea that if you start throwing your love, attention, affection, your time, all to your wife for free, then she's going to lose her ability to value what you have to offer her. And so instead, you got to say, no, I'm going to direct myself a certain way and invite you along, but there's going to be a price to have my time. You have to make sure that you're living within my boundaries too. And so in the same way, if the church were to start taking a hint from that and say, hey, we're more about quality than we are about quantity, and we have a purpose and a direction that we're going, and we can give you something that actually means something rather than just sitting in a chair and feeling good about yourself, I think that would significantly raise the bar and put people in a spot where they'll actually be willing and able to make progress on changing some of that.
That's good.
Yeah.
How are you going to implement that?
Quick thought. Yeah, I think this is what, like, churches that do membership, this is probably where they need to take a quick look and see, does our membership mean anything? I've gone to churches where they have membership, but you treat the members identically with the non-members. In fact, if anything, the members, they get all the downsides, so to speak, of accountability and having to serve and everything else. And the non-members are the ones who get the VIP treatment. And so guess what? You don't get a lot of people signing up to be members. And I think that when you look at how did Christ orient his discipleship, there was an in-group and an out-group. When you look at the early church, bad thing that's part of that is, and I think the church needs to understand that there should be a fundamental benefit to having become a Christian, even on a material level. And I mean, I'm not going to sing their praises too much because of, weird theology, but I think Mormons do this aspect well. They are very generous and they're very outgoing and hospitable in many ways, but there's still a preferential treatment that you see Mormons offer to other Mormons. And so I think that that's actually a more biblical model of what it means to be a disciple among a community of disciples than what most Protestant churches and frankly Catholic churches, from what I've seen, practice.
Yeah, so with that, I've actually been part of a membership committee that was supposed to decide how membership in the congregation was going to be organized, run, what the requirements would be, what members could do and what non-members could do and not. And then I've actually had a sister and one of my friends who in different congregations have been in that spot. And I think nobody's ever asked me to do that again, because usually my suggestion is eliminate membership altogether in the way that it's being implemented most of the time. Because, and I had one pastor who I did respect, and he would say something, membership is kind of this bizarre thing. I'm a member at Sam's Club, but what does that mean, right? You can be a member in so many different things, but nobody really cares. It's a flippant thing. And there's no biblical precedent for saying you have to be a member of this or that body.
Can I challenge that idea just real quick?
Sure.
I think membership is for the pastors, because of the idea of knowing who they're discipling, because they have to give an account to people before God. And so I think the idea of membership is ultimately to their benefit, to know, okay, this person is a committed disciple, and that's the person that I have to give an answer to God, not the random person who decided to show up one Sunday, or he shows up, once every quarter or something like that. So I think the idea of membership is really an accountability that goes to the benefit of the pastors primarily. So in terms of biblical precedent, I think when you look at they have to give an answer to what they've done with their responsibilities as pastor and all of the qualifications that is there, that requires knowing who that is. And so I think that's where the idea of membership comes from.
So I'll just say that there is utility to having membership. I don't know that I would say that there's ever an actual example in the Bible of saying, hey, you need to sign this form to become a member of our body.
Of course.
Right? That part doesn't exist. But I do agree that there is utility to it, but not the way that it's being utilized today. And when you give it out for free so flippantly with very minimal covenants and there's no enforcement of those, that's where you get into the problem, because now you're setting up these standards and giving people rights without any actual accountability to making sure that they're holding up to the responsibilities.
Yeah, and I think this is the idea. Sorry, just to interrupt real quick again. I think heavily persecuted, and so to be a member meant something, at least in the sense of hey, you're the kind of person that we trust is genuine about their faith and not going to rat us out to the civil authorities, and so we're going to offer you communion and all the benefits of membership. Nowadays, at least not for now, we don't have that kind of fear in mind, but there was to your point, a utility to that, in the sense of you had to be very selective about the people that you would really allow into the worship.
I can definitely see that. Sorry, Leo, I feel like you might have been cut off a couple times.
That's okay. Do you guys want to, I feel like we could keep going on this topic for a little bit, but we're at kind of a time length. Do you guys want to stop recording, start recording, and continue? Or do you guys just want to continue and make it one big long thing?
I say we'll call it quits for the day.
Yeah, I'm pretty good for right now. I got some stuff I got to get to.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, it's been a fun conversation, and hopefully we'll pick up next week with some more interesting things for everybody to listen in on as we chat among ourselves.
Yeah, I think one thing, just a quick point of feedback to myself, and you guys, either this resonates with you, but as I think about my contributions to this discussion, I have a lack of having, got verse and passage up in front of me. Thinking about the topic ahead of time, there's a few that I've kind of misquoted or near quoted, that sort of thing. So I think it'd be helpful in my own thinking to at least organize a few verses to, add to the conversation. So we're not just, I don't want my opinion to be the thing that drives my answers, I guess.
Good point. Yeah. Having some off the top of your head would be great.
Cool. All right. Well, I will catch y'all later.
All right.
Take it easy.
Love you guys. Talk to you later.
Peace.